Summary of the Ethics of Ambiguity by Simone De Beauvoir. In The Ethics of Ambiguity, Simone de Beauvoir, a French philosopher from the 20th century, asks what ethics look like from the point of view of the existentialist theory she and Jean-Paul Sartre made together. Most ethical systems try to figure out what people should do based on abstract moral principles. Existentialists, on the other hand, don't think it makes sense to talk about such absolute moral principles because morality is something that people learn and develop over the course of their lives, not something that has always been there. Instead of starting with a picture of what is good, right, or fair, de Beauvoir starts with the basic fact of human freedom, which she says must be the basis of all morality because it is the only reason people can make moral choices at all. De Beauvoir divides her book into 3 parts: the philosophical foundations of her Ethics of Ambiguity, the different kinds of ethical attitudes people can have depending on how they feel about their freedom, and what existentialism has to say about how people should treat each other. In Part 1, Ambiguity and Freedom, de Beauvoir starts by explaining how the human experience is ambiguous. People honestly pursue their goals even though they know they will die. Everyone feels like a subject with a will in the world, but experiences everyone else as an object. And everyone knows that everyone else sees them as an object. And as much as people feel empowered to act in the world, they also know that the world is much bigger than they are. De Beauvoir says that most philosophers have tried to solve one side of this ambiguity or the other. For example, they have said that people are immortal or that only their intentions count. Existentialism, on the other hand, says that this can't be resolved into one side or the other of the binary. No matter how hard people try to make the world do what they want and reach their goals, they will always fail. This is exactly why people need ethics, to give them something to work toward. Many philosophers say that existentialism makes morality seem meaningless and subjective. However, de Beauvoir, following in Sartre's footsteps, believes that morality is subjective but has meaning because all meaning is subjective. De Beauvoir gives a short summary of Sartre's theory and argues that people don't necessarily fail if they don't reach the goals they set for themselves. Instead, they can learn to take delight in this very effort toward an impossible possession. By accepting their ambiguity instead of giving up, people can come to want not the impossible moral perfection that other, more abstract systems of ethics promise them, but rather to be a disclosure of being. De Beauvoir says that all action reveals who the actor is because it comes from their skills, ideals, and commitments. The only desire that can be met is the desire to show who you really are. This is the same as wanting your own freedom, or the ability to be who you are instead of trying to be what someone else says you should be. Freedom is both the starting point and the end goal of ethics, as shown by de Beauvoir. Everyone is naturally free, which means they can act on their own, but it is up to them to turn this natural freedom into real moral freedom by willing themselves free. To do this, you need to carefully think about your own deeds and your big personal project. You also need to make sure that your past, present, and future are all connected. After describing what a morally good will looks like, de Beauvoir ends the first part of her essay by asking what a morally bad will looks like. She agrees that people can't will themselves to be unfree, but she also points out that people start with natural freedom but not moral freedom, and they can definitely keep themselves from reaching moral freedom by refusing to accept the uncertainty of life or work to make themselves and the world better. This is what existentialists think of as the same thing as moral evil. Importantly, de Beauvoir points out that while many ethical systems blame evil on human flaws or moral mistakes, only existentialists hold people truly and fully responsible for their mistakes. This is why the existentialist view of good and evil is more complete and less forgiving of selfishness and apathy toward others. In Part 2, Personal Freedom and Others, de Beauvoir explains in detail how people make moral mistakes, especially when they don't respect the freedom of others. She starts with a picture of childhood, in which the child sees the grown-up world as full of fixed and important values, but also sees themselves as safe in their own world of play, where their actions have no moral consequences. As people get older, though, they understand that adults aren't perfect, that values aren't set in stone, and that what they do has moral and real-world effects. In other words, teenagers understand that they are free, but also that they have responsibilities. From this point on, they have to decide what to do with their freedom and responsibility, either by turning their natural freedom into moral freedom or by avoiding the question. According to De Beauvoir, the worst thing you can do is become a subman. The subman is so afraid of action and its results that he tries to do nothing. He wishes he were a lifeless object, so he wouldn't have to be responsible for what he does. The serious man, like the subman, does everything he can to keep himself from being free. He does this by picking and sticking to a set of fixed values that come from somewhere else. He believes for the sake of believing, just so he doesn't have to deal with the responsibility of choosing his own views based on his own thoughts. Next is the nihilist, who accepts that there are no absolute moral values in the world, but sees this as a tragedy instead of an opportunity to seize his freedom and make his own values. The nihilist has a will to destruction and commits disorder and anarchy in an attempt to show everyone else that their values are made up. Most of the time, the nihilist ends up killing himself because he knows how complicated life is, but not that he has the right to live. The next type of person is an explorer. He or she is close to a truly moral attitude because they are eager to try new things and enjoy their freedom. But the adventurer doesn't really care about morals. He just wants to win and succeed in his projects, no matter what they are. He is often willing to step on other people's freedom for his own pleasure. By doing this, he proves that he will never be truly free, because each person's freedom depends on the freedom of everyone else, both because people are all the same and because they need each other to survive in the world. The last of de Beauvoir's figures is the passionate person, who is the opposite of the adventurer and also close to real freedom, but not quite there. The passionate person has the right kind of sincere moral commitment, but he cares so much that he can't let go when he can't reach his goals, so he gives up his freedom. In the third and longest part of the book, which is split into 5 shorter parts, de Beauvoir talks about a number of problems that all have to do with how a free person relates to the rest of humanity. She has already said that each person's freedom relies on the freedom of everyone else. Here, she looks at what that means. In the first part, she says that the aesthetic attitude, or the abstract, faraway view that critics and philosophers often take, is a way for intellectuals to hide the fact that they are real, unique, free people. In the second part, freedom and liberation, she looks at how, from an existentialist point of view, the downtrodden keep fighting for their freedom in small, steady steps. Many people are in such bad situations that the only way they can move toward freedom is by rebelling against the forces that are putting them down. Oppressors often fear and punish this kind of response, but there is no question that the freedom of the oppressed to pursue their goals without being forced into a way of life they have not chosen is a meaningful freedom, while the freedom of the oppressor to deny others their freedom is no freedom at all, because it hurts others' freedom, and everyone's real freedom depends on everyone else's. People who are in power often try to make people forget how important freedom is by making and promoting other values, such as a culture's unique history or capitalism's ability to make things happen. But tradition and business only matter if they help people be free. This shows again that freedom is the most important goal of human action. In the third part of her last part, de Beauvoir asks how the downtrodden should act to get their freedom. She comes to the conclusion that sometimes doing wrong is the only way to stop wrong. This includes using violence against people who have contributed to oppression out of duty or ignorance, those who are responsible but not guilty for ignorance, or having to choose between 2 liberation struggles that are at odds with each other. It can even mean sacrificing one's own friends or oneself. To successfully rebel against rulers who take away people's freedom and bring them down to their facts, people must use the same tools to bring themselves and their enemies down to their facts. Both tyrants and revolutionaries tell their people that their sacrifices are for a better, freer future. However, this is the same mistake that philosophers make when they see ethics as an absolute rather than a respect for freedom that is built into every action. By making each person worthless, tyrants and rebels destroy their own goals and turn society's value into zero. This is why de Beauvoir likes democracy, which puts the dignity of each man first and refuses to give up anyone for a perfect future that will never come true, since people will always be fighting for freedom. The real ethical problem comes up, though, when you have to choose between two people's freedoms that are at odds with each other. You have to decide based on which will lead to more freedom in the long run, which is why an unjust revolution is better than an unjust dictatorship. Now that she has shown that the question of whose freedom to prioritize depends on thinking about the future, De Beauvoir turns to the concept of the future, which she says is split. People both think of the future as a continuation of the present and hope for a utopian, perfect future that has nothing to do with the present and in which glory, happiness, or justice magically falls on the earth. This last idea of the future is what can make people give up the present, but it is based on a false hope for perfection. In fact, all human striving is limited, and ambiguity is a constant part of life. Politicians take advantage of people's desire for a perfect future and weakness for ideas by promising them one. This is how Europe justified colonialism, for example. De Beauvoir says that instead of being swayed by the promise of infinity, people should celebrate their existence, their finite goals, and their finite wills. In the last part, De Beauvoir goes back to the question of uncertainty and digs deeper into what it takes to make ethical decisions. She decides that these kinds of decisions should be based on the freedom of the individual as such, and she will accept violence only if it opens concrete doors to the freedom I'm trying to save. She uses French politics as an example. People who think of themselves as enlightened elites pretend to rule on behalf of France's colonial subjects, but in reality, they use their gestures for the colonized people's well-being as a way to keep oppressing and exploiting them. She thinks that the only moral thing to do is to work for people's freedom, not to try to civilize people who are not European. She then looks at the Soviet Union, which has too often used the goals of its revolution as a reason to oppress people, even though it is possible that sometimes it would be right to oppress people in order to help them get free. When you make this hard choice, to use violence and oppression to stop violence and oppression, you take on a huge duty and have to be very careful, detailed, and thoughtful. Most politicians and revolutionaries don't meet this standard, which is why they also need critics. If they value freedom, they must accept free resistance to their own ways. In a short conclusion, De Beauvoir says a few big-picture things about the link between existentialist ethics and her critics and other ethical systems. Even though existentialism focuses on the individual, since it is the individual who makes free decisions and pursues their own projects, she insists that it is not solipsistic because it sees other people's freedom as important for any individuals. She asks if the existentialist idea of subjective moral value has any real meaning, but she also reminds the reader that nothing has meaning outside of subjective human perspectives, and that it makes no sense to judge morality by the standard of objective truth, which no one person could ever know. By basing morality on concrete actions in people's finite projects, De Beauvoir says, existentialists affirm that people can make real contributions to the world and embrace their own freedom. If everyone did this, people could finally stop dreaming about a completely free utopia, because they would have it.
About the author. Simone de Beauvoir was raised in Paris by a conservative father and a devoutly Catholic mother. She grew up with her parents' ideas, but she was a brilliant thinker from an early age. She read the classics when she was young, taught her younger sister while they were growing up, and decided to give up religion when she was a teenager. Her family's finances fell apart during World War I, so her father couldn't pay a dowry. This made de Beauvoir happy, since she wanted to become a thinker instead of getting married. She went to the Sorbonne to study philosophy. She was the youngest person to pass the difficult agrégation exam in her field, and she came in second in the country. Jean-Paul Sartre got the highest score, and while they were studying for the test, they became friends. They became intellectual and physical bedfellows and stayed that way for the rest of their lives. Even though their relationship was widely open, de Beauvoir had relationships with both men and women, including a number of well-known intellectuals, at different times in her life. Sartre asked her to marry him in 1931, but she said no. During the 1930s, they both taught philosophy in schools, but in the early 1940s, They both lost their jobs. De Beauvoir was fired for her political views by the Nazi-controlled government, and Sartre was taken as a prisoner of war. She went back to teaching for a short time, but was fired again, this time for supposedly seducing a female student. From then on, she worked as a writer for the rest of her life. From 1943 to 1949, she wrote 8 books, including 3 stories and 2 of her most important non-fiction books, The Ethics of Ambiguity, 1947, and The Second Sex, 1949. Many people say that this book helped start the feminist movement in France in the 20th century. Many of her books, like She Came to Stay, 1943, and The Mandarins, 1954, which won her the prestigious Prix Goncourt, were based on her own experiences. Because of her literary success, the scandal over her relationship with Jean-Paul Sartre, and the popularity of Sartre's magazine Les Temps Modernes, she was a well-known figure in French society for the rest of her life. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, she wrote a lot. In the 1970s, she became a well-known member of the French women's liberation movement, which is now better known as the second wave of feminism. She played a key role in the fight to make abortion legal in France. In 1986, she died in Paris of pneumonia.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.